Mexican Cornwall. I'll bet that's something most of you have never heard of before. Well, in fact, not only does it exist, along with Mexican pasties, Mexican engine houses, and a whole host of other things, but unlike some parts of the world, these links aren't simply in the past, but continued and celebrated even today. Dydh. Today we're taking a break from the overview videos to uncover the story of Kernewek miners and their descendants in Mexico, and just in time for El Día de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, as well as the year which marks the 200th anniversary of the first known Kernewek immigrants to Mexico. We'll be looking at the story of Little Cornwall in Hidalgo, and in particular looking at the town of Real del Monte and the city of Pachuca, located on the very outskirts of Mexico City. These being the main destinations of the Kernewek diaspora in Mexico. And I have to add, before I get started, an apology to any Mexicans or Spanish-speaking people watching. I will be trying my best to pronounce names and places, but I'm sure I'll butcher them nonetheless. Now, starting with the story, we have to go all the way back to 1824, exactly 200 years ago. During this time, many Mexican silver mines were in a state of dilapidation and disrepair. Some were simply using outdated methods and technologies, while others weren't even running anymore. So when a group of British investors decided to buy some struggling mines at Mineral del Monte, commonly known as Real del Monte, they decided who better to get these mines up and running than the world-famous hard rock miners from Kernow. And so, the Company of Gentlemen Adventurers in the Mines of Real del Monte was founded. Catchy, I know. They recruited just over 130 miners and engineers, primarily from Camborne, Redruth and Gwenap, and set off for Mexico. Arriving about a year later in Veracruz, they had to make an arduous journey across marshes and rainforests, while dragging their equipment and steam engines with donkeys all the way to Hidalgo, where they would set up in Real del Monte. Sadly, some of them would die making this journey, with yellow fever being a particular threat. The majority were able to arrive safely and establish themselves, however, and used their steam engines to drain the mines of groundwater just as they would in Kernow. And, by the 1840s, there were around 350 Kernewek men working the mines and living in Hidalgo. Originally, the choice to come to Mexico, like anywhere these workers went, was for the bold and adventurous few who, for a whole host of reasons, wished to leave Kernow, either permanently or temporarily. However, as the decades go by and the mining industry begins to collapse in Kernow during the latter 19th century, Mexico and places like it become a place of refuge for desperate miners and their families who joined pre-established Kernewek communities in an effort to find work. Some of these Kernewek immigrants would eventually return back home to Kernow, with the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910 causing much of the diaspora to flee, especially since it came with a decline in the Mexican mining industry. Many others, however, would stay and settle permanently, being born, having families, and eventually dying in Mexico, their new home. So, that's the story of how the Kernewek diaspora got to Mexico, but let's look at the impact they had on both the region and the wider country. Possibly the single most important service they performed, at least to many Mexicans at large, was the bringing of football to Mexico. Mexico's first ever football club was created by miners from Redruth and Camborne, called the Pachuca Athletic Club, and was founded in 1892. It would eventually go on to become CF Pachuca. CF Pachuca is amongst the very oldest football clubs in the Americas and was a founding member of Mexico's top-ranking Primera Division. leading the city today to proudly claim to be the cradle of Mexican football. Although initially having an all-Kernewek team, Mexicans would eventually make their way onto the team, and by 1920 a large part of the team were Mexican, but with a Kernewek miner's son as their manager. His name was Alfred C. Kroll, and was instrumental in setting up Mexico's official football scene. Kroll was Mexican-born, with his dad coming from St. Blaise in Kernow. Whilst his dad was a miner, Kroll was very much uninterested in mining, and instead his great passion was football, which he would follow from a young age. He would lead CF Pachuca to become league champions between 1917 and 1920, would help to found Mexico's first ever official and regulated football matches, and in 1935 he would lead an all-Mexican national team to their first international tournament victory as their manager. Indeed, Kroll and those Kernewek footballers started a legacy in Mexico that today Mexicans proudly carry and continue, with the country being ranked amongst the top 20 international teams worldwide. Contributions don't end at football though. A much less well-known one, albeit perhaps more stereotypically Kernewek, is the Mexican Pasty. As you might guess from the name, it's a Mexican take on the traditional Cornish pasty. Pasties were, unsurprisingly, a cuisine brought with those early Kernewek miners, and soon the practice would embed itself in Pachuca and Real del Monte. But locals would adapt the recipe, making use of Mexican ingredients and cuisine. Often pineapples, sweetened rice, tinga or similar such things will be used instead of traditional steak or apple recipes. And Mexican pasties, unsurprisingly, tend to have a bit of a spicy kick when compared to their Kernewek counterparts. There is also a slight difference in production. Whilst in Kernow, the pastry is often left to sit for a day before being used, Mexicans instead use it straight away. The iconic crimping of the pastry, however, remains. And then there's the physical footprint of the Kernewek diaspora in Hidalgo. Walking around Pachuca or Real del Monte, you may see echoes of a Kernewek Mexican past still present, with some parts proudly being maintained and carried into the future. The most iconic of which is Pachuca's clock tower. A young Camborne lad called Francis Rule left at 17 in 1853 and made his way to Mexico, where he would eventually become rich and known as El Rey de la Plata, or the Silver King. He would become a beneficiary of Pachuca and donated large sums of money to the city, including financing the beautiful Spanish Baroque clock tower, which has the very same mechanisms within as London's Big Ben. His house, built in a Regency French style, was also the head office for the British Mining Company there, and today it still remains. On top of these, there is also the Panteon Ingles, or the English Cemetery, which was set up by Thomas Strafford, a mine manager who was part of the first group to arrive. There are about 755 graves in the cemetery, all told, with the oldest dating to 1834, and the latest seemingly being the memorial to John Vial from 1916. John, or Johnny, Vial would leave Mexico to fight for Britain in World War I, and unfortunately died in the Somme in 1916 at just 22 years old. After which, although he was buried at Rouen in France, a grave would be erected in his honour by his family at Real del Monte's British Cemetery. For as much as he was Kernewek, he was also Mexican, and Real del Monte was very much his home and birthplace. Kernewek miners are also largely credited with bringing Methodism to Mexico as well, with Pachuca's Methodist Church being founded by them. Finally, just as in Kernow, across Hidalgo you can find engine houses built by the miners to work the silver mines. They act as a physical remnant to the important role of Kernewek miners in 19th century Mexico. And so instrumental were they that Kernewek and British mining companies were granted special rights and concessions by President Porfirio Diaz in 1900 as part of his efforts to modernize and reinvigorate the Mexican economy. So, that's the history of those links, and before that the story. Now let's travel forward a bit and discuss what's happening today, and how that wonderful Mexican Kernewek connection remains. Of course, there are families and surnames who remain as descendants of the 19th century diaspora, but there has been a push for reviving our links since around the noughties. The modern revival largely starts in 2006, as the Cornish Mexican Cultural Society was founded by Richard Williams, with the aim of promoting and re-establishing the historical and cultural links between Mexico and Kernow. Then, since around 2007, the Mexican Embassy in London and local government of Hidalgo have been officially trying to strengthen and recognise the connections between Kernow and their so-called Little Cornwall. This went on to be marked in a special twinning ceremony in 2008, where Kernewek, Redruth and Camborne, the homes of many of those first miners, were officially twinned with Mexican Real del Monte and Pachuca, respectively. And in 2009, the first Festival Internacional del Pasty, or International Pasty Festival, was created by Victor Aladro, the president of the Cornish Mexican Pasty Association. And this was opened by Hidalgo's tourism secretary of the time, Maria Auralia Vega Ortiz. Taking place in Real del Monte, the festival lasts for 3 days, and today attracts over 20,000 visitors, with it now being one of Hidalgo's biggest festivals. And a museum in the area is also dedicated to the history of the Cornish pasty and Mexican pasté. In 2013, a later tourism minister, Juan Renato Olivares, would visit Kernow to promote these links further, which was reciprocated in 2014 by the then Duke and Duchess of Kernow, Charles and Camilla, who visited Hidalgo to celebrate El Día de los Muertos and represent Kernow, even visiting the Pasty Museum. This all culminated in the current Mexican ambassador to the UK, Miss Josefa González Blanco, attending Kernow's main St. Piran's Day celebrations in Truro last year as a special guest and speaker, where she discussed and celebrated the links between Mexico and Kernow, telling the history of that relationship to all those gathered outside Truro Cathedral.
It's a great relationship between Cornwall and Mexico, as Bertie you mentioned. 1825, a group of Cornish people came to Mexico and they brought the pasty. We still eat it. And of course, we took the pasty. It's still the same. We put a little bit of chili because we couldn't help it. Of course, wouldn't be Mexican.
And there we have it. That is, more or less, the entire story of Kernow's history and special relationship with Mexico. Unlike many other places around the world where Kernewek miners went and settled, Hidalgo and Mexico remain a unique case where those Kernewek links, symbols and traditions have survived and blended with the local community, where the Kernewek immigrants contributed in part to the wider national culture, and where today that country and some of its officials still actively remember, celebrate and promote such links with Kernow. Other parts of the world where the Kernewek diaspora went cannot say the same thing. Indeed, it is my hope that these links grow ever stronger in the years to come. And I would urge any Mexicans visiting Britain, or any Kernewek people and their descendants visiting Mexico, to travel to Kernow or Hidalgo, respectively, where you can experience this unique history, receive a warm welcome from locals, and be an important part of the story of reconnecting our two cultures, helping these bonds grow ever stronger between us. In the meantime, I hope Mexicans around the world have a wonderful Dia de los Muertos, and until you visit Kernow, Duganis ha Miraz. Thanks, and goodbye.